Hi, Evelyn again. Today I'm going over the fourth question that we had for our class. It is what makes educational and school psychologists leaders in evidence-based school intervention? And as Dr. Stevens has already kind of said, of course, like reading through everything that we've read to this point in our class kind of supports the theory that, yeah, everything needs to be evidence-based. So I'm kind of just going through that, and then at the end I kind of want to go through high stakes testing because it really hit home for me on one issue, but I'll get to that later. So anyways, to first answer this question, I wanted to kind of explain how evidence-based school interventions are useful. Foreman looks at the factors that are important to successfully implement evidence-based interventions in school settings. He had a study that included an interview that focused on potential organizers and barriers to execution and stability of their interventions. So basically how well intervention, or how things that you need to be able to get past to get the interventions to work in the schools. So there are 7 main things that were reported with sustainable implementation of interventions. So these are things that are going to help interventions stay in the school for longer and more sustainable over time. So they needed administrative support, teacher support, allocation of financial resources to support practice, high quality training that sustains consistent practice, interventions that align with the school's main mission, program outcomes are visible to stakeholders, and addressing turnover of staff in administration. So those are 7 things that you need to look at when, or at least that he noticed in his interviews with these people that led to successful interventions. Over the last 2 decades, there have been an increase in the number of interventions available to children and adolescents that have mental health issues. Evidence-based interventions are empirically supported with research findings and show valuable and predictable outcomes. High-quality professional practice in school psychology includes evidence-based interventions. There have been recent laws that mandate evidence-based interventions, probably like in the last decade, these laws have come out. The first one is the Individual with Disability Education Act, IDEA that we follow, and the No Child Left Behind Act are included in these 2 legislations. And we'll kind of go over them a little bit later. And the No Child Left Behind Act also has high-stake testing in it, which is why I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. It has been shown that even with these recent laws, there's still low implementation of evidence-based interventions in school. And I really think that that has something to do with high-stake testings because the goals of most schools are not interventions. It's when they made the No Child Left Behind Act, a lot of corruption and stuff came out, and people are so focused on getting these high test scores because if not, they're going to get punished. It leads to people only caring about that and teaching based off of what the test is going to have and not what the child actually needs, or kind of writing off the kids that have mental issues and they don't want to deal with them. They want the kids that are going to do well because that's going to get them more money for their school. So there's heavy reliance on old practices that lack scientific data to support them as well. Even when schools use evidence-based practices, they are used with low reliability. Foreman claims that implementation fidelity found that only 25 to 50% of programs implement in a nationally representative sample of schools were at dosage levels comparable to those in research-based programs. Even when evidence-based interventions are used but are of poor quality, the positive outcomes tend to be mitigated. One second, I lost my place. This study outcome, like the study that Foreman did, supports the importance of developing support from school administrators and principals, kind of how I was talking about how like they don't really care that much because they care more about testing. Principals need to be instrumental in implementation of evidence-based interventions. Principals also were found to need to have management skills and direct involvement and support for the intervention. So if the principals are more worried about high stakes testing and standardized testing like STAR and TAX test, they're not going to care that much about the interventions that we're trying to implement, and I feel like that's bad because it's been proven that we need the principals to care for them to even work. When teachers can see physical results from the new programs, they are more readily available, but when it came to high quality training, it was harder to get principals and teachers to participate. That had a lot to do with the trainings taking a lot of time out of their hands, and I think, what did he say next? There was evidence to support that the time that it takes to participate in the trainings and the professional developments and not having the same goals and initiatives of the school hindered the qualities of the trainings. So not only are they taking time to go to these trainings, but the trainings don't really have the same goals and expectations that the schools that they work at have. So there's kind of a gap between the two. Like the professional developments are there, but they take a lot of time, and these teachers don't really connect with them in a way that makes sense to them for their school, so they don't use them. So this study's main goal was to try to find factors that could help in facilitating the implementations and sustainability of new interventions in schools. This is important because this article supports that evidence-based interventions are crucial to school and educational psychologists. Other fields may use other ways of diagnosis, such as the DSM-5, which we've talked about a little bit, that has little evidence-based diagnoses. So they're not using evidence-based stuff in the DSM-5 as much as they should be. That led to misdiagnosis in many cases, or leads to, yeah, you understand. School psychologists, however, lean on evidence-based practices because there is an importance in the schools to evaluate mental health and implement interventions that are correct according to the laws that we abide by in IDEA. So I'm going to talk a little bit about IDEA now. The Individuals with Disability Act, IDEA, and the No Child Left Behind Act are two legislations that mandate evidence-based interventions. According to Ethics and Law for School Psychologists, both IDEA and No Child Left Behind Act called for school psychologists and other educational specialists to use scientifically based academic and behavioral interventions. So that's kind of, I mean, they're both calling for it, we need it, and it's something that's in our ethics. So we should be using it, and I think that has a large part to do with why we're the leaders in evidence-based, because it's a large majority of what we do and what we should be doing if you were a perfect educational psychologist. But I think, honestly, personally, I mean, it's been embedded in my head that we should be using evidence-based interventions, and that makes sense. So also, Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 defined evidence-based interventions as a it's multifaceted, so there's different sections to it, and I mean, IDEA goes through it, and there's a lot of different definitions of evidence-based intervention. So when you're reading articles, you should really be aware of like what definition they're using as evidence-based, but we'll go through, I have a whole section on that. But anyways, so this book that I'm going through had it as demonstrates a statistically significant effect on improving student outcomes or other relevant outcome based on strong, moderate, or promising evidence from at least one well-designed and one well-implemented study. And I kind of summarized that, but it has a whole section in that book, and I know most of us have it, so if you really want to go look at it, it's there. Because it's pretty long and I didn't want to read all of it. But that's basically what it says, is it's very vague, and I feel like that's kind of problematic for people who want it to be so well defined. And I think it's on this spectrum rather than just being like, oh, this is what evidence-based intervention is. It's more like, okay, so it's close enough to being, and it can help this student in this way. And I mean, as educational psychologists, school psychologists, we need to be looking at the child and have things individualized for them. So if this intervention is going to work and it's mostly evidence-based, I think that's going to help them the most. We use it, and it's technically evidence-based. It's just a very vague definition of it. There also needs to be a demonstration of positive and relevant outcomes for the student through high-quality research findings or ongoing efforts to examine outcomes. So I like that they added that because it means that, like, it needs to show that it helps students. Like, if you went and used this intervention and it's not helping anybody, why? Like, obviously it's not evidence-based, but I like that because it helps us to have a more vague interpretation of what is evidence-based, and if you see that this intervention is helping these students in the same setting that your student is in, like the study had the same sort of type things that your student is going through right now, use it. That it's helping them, it's going to help them, it's fine, and it is technically evidence-based according to this definition. Okay, so school psychologists' codes of ethics require a use of problem-solving processes to develop interventions that are proper for the manifesting problems and that are consistent with the data collected. The code of ethics school psychologist abides by also state that the evidence-based approaches they take need to be adapted for the individual that they are being used for. So kind of what I was talking about right now. Practitioners need to strive for fidelity to the treatment program as it described in the research literature, while at the same time adapting the interventions to the unique characteristics of the student. So that's kind of like what I was saying. It's on a spectrum, and you need to make sure that you're not just following the research to the T. You need to be adapting what you've read for the student. And that makes a lot of sense to me because that's the whole point of an IEP. It needs to be individualized for that student. This adds to the notion that school and educational psychologists are the leaders in evidence-based interventions because it is embedded in our core ethics to do so, and it is best practice. This means that all school and educational psychologists should be using evidence-based practices. Should, because, our job is sticky sometimes. Let me see. Okay. So, while answering this question, it's important to look at differing definitions of evidence-based practices. The introduction to this book, the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, lists multiple criteria that make an intervention evidence-based. Right, so this is a different book that I was using. I don't have the book name. Well, anyway, so this is a different definition that I found going through my research. And this one's a little bit more detailed. So, this book has it's multi-criteria like the other definition was, but it's more defined. So these include at least 2 or more studies with the following. This is the definition of evidence-based interventions. Careful specifications of the patient population, random assignment of participants to conditions, use of treatment manuals that document the procedures, multiple outcome measures, rater if used or naive to conditions, including, of course, measurement of the problem or disorder targeted in the treatment. Statistically significant differences between treatment and a comparison group after treatment, and replication of outcome effects, ideally by an independent investigator or research team. So this definition of evidence-based interventions is way more scrutinous compared to the ESSA one. That was the one I just listed to you before. Ways claims definitions are much more definite and more focused on the procedure used by the researcher. According to Ways, I don't know what his last name is. Evidence-based interventions should be considered a spectrum and not one definite answer. So that's kind of what I was talking about earlier. Using words like promising and almost evidence-based are considered various levels of evidence-based intervention. So like promising research that we found that does help kids is still technically evidence-based, even though it might not fall under all the criteria listed above. This is important to note because when considering research-based interventions, finding the criteria the researcher used for considering it evidence-based. Educational and school psychologists are mandated by their ethics to use evidence-based interventions. Knowing all the criteria in the study is useful when finding suitable interventions for students. Students with mental disorders come in varieties too. So when considering this definition, it can be helpful to be flexible for the student's intervention if it is in the child's best interest. I think I always come back to we're here for the kid, and it's always, everything we're doing is for the best interest of the student, always, always, always. So it makes sense to me that we can be flexible with this definition. So Odom also claims that, so this is about high stakes, no it's not, hold on. So Odom also claims that special education as a field of research is complicated because educational researchers do sciences that face problems and must deal with local conditions that limit generalization and theory building. So this one kind of went into the idea that there are these 12 categories that IDEA states for us that a student can fall under. And 12 is a lot, and that's a lot of variability. And these categories have spectrums within them, such as autism and intellectual disability. This sort of variety makes it even harder for special education researchers to develop proper methodologies that are still considered evidence-based. This supports the evidence-based interventions should be considered on a spectrum as well and should be more flexible throughout the use of them. Educational and school psychologists work in the most variable environments when compared to harder sciences such as chemistry and medicine. This means there is more individuality within each case, and interventions are always more individualized, so it's harder to pinpoint a definite intervention for each category defined by IDEA that will work for everyone in that category. So there's not one definite intervention that we can give each of the 12 categories, because we need to be looking at the student in itself, not just, oh, they have this category, throw that in. It's not a cookie cutter system. We need to be looking at each kid individually. So I think now I'm going to talk a little bit about high stakes testing, because it really bothered me when I was reading about it. High stakes testing is defined as the practice of attaching important consequences to standardized test scores. So the No Child Left Behind Act is driven by high stakes testing, and I was kind of talking about it before because it's calling on us for it's calling on us to lost my train of thought. The No Child Left Behind Act calls on us to do evidence-based interventions, but it also calls on teachers and principals to have high-stakes testing in education. As stated earlier, high-stakes testing is built on the idea that there will be rewards and punishments in place to help teachers work harder and to motivate students more. And that all sounds fine and dandy, but it does have some consequences to it, and a lot of those consequences come from corruption and distortions of social processes that it's meant to monitor. So all over the country, there have been crimes of inflated test scores to increase schools' ratings. And I'm going to talk specifically about one that happened in the school district that I went to school in El Paso. You might have heard about it. I read about it on NPR. So the El Paso Independent School District Superintendent Lorenzo Garcia was convicted of fraud and reported false test scores for financial gain. This happened in 2010, I believe. He got arrested initially, but there had been previous attempts, or people had red flags about this before it happened, and nobody really investigated. They kind of just threw it under the rug. But in 2010, he did finally get caught. Garcia inflated test scores at Bowie High School by not testing poor performing sophomores, changing failing grades to passing, and compelling struggling students to drop out of school altogether. So a superintendent was trying to force kids out of school to get his test scores up because he was under that much pressure from the No Child Left Behind Act. And doing this changed his school rating from poor to acceptable, and led to him getting a $56,000 bonus. Now, that's a lot of money that could be going to other things, but that's a whole different thing I can go into. This kind of corruption is caused by high stakes testing. It's that pressure to do well, and it leads to people doing awful things and not helping students when they should be. This case is proof that under the current system of high stakes testing, corruption is happening at the expense of students' education. High stakes testing can also lead to infractions on the student's end. With so much pressure to succeed, students may be led to cheating and only exposed to teaching on the test by the teachers. So they're only learning what's going to be on the test because that's important to the school and they need that money, or they need to be at acceptable level. And that's not right. These teachers should be looking into things that are helping all students and not just for the test's sake. With all the research supporting the claims that high stakes testing is having negative impacts on school, it is still in place today. Although educational psychologists can use research to support interventions, it is hard to accomplish school-wide goals that are parallel to those interventions when there is high stakes testing still present. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. when I was listing off things that help sustain interventions over time. One of them was, three of them: principals being animate about it, teachers being animate about it, and the goals being the same. The goals being parallel with those of the school. And if the school's goal is to only look at high stakes testing and only care about high stakes testing, that intervention is not going to work for that student. So this affects us too. So I don't know. I thought it was really important, and I just wanted to share that because it happened while I was in high school. And I went to a different high school, but it's still crazy that, I mean, you'd think it's not going to happen in your district, but it does. So you need to consider that when doing your work. So yeah, that's my answer to this question. Okay, bye guys.